Welkom bij Holland Doc 24, welkom bij Gesprek op 24. Onze gast met wie ik ga praten, die wil de mens de vrije wil teruggeven. Want neurowetenschappers, hersenkenners als Dick Swaap en Victor Lamme, die betogen in bestsellers als Wij zijn ons brein en De vrije wil bestaat niet, dat wij mensen eigenlijk maar slaafse volgelingen zijn van toevallige processen in ons hoofd. Tijd dus voor een antwoord van de filosofie. Peter Hacker is hier, hij is filosoof aan de Universiteit van Oxford. Welcome, Mr. Hacker.
Thank you very much.
I'm very happy that you are here. You discuss a lot with neuroscientists. Here in Holland we have two very famous, very good selling authors. One is called Dick Swaap, who sold 400,000 copies of his book. The other one is called Victor Lamme. He's a neuroscientist as well. He said that he tried to feed your book to his dog.
Yes. It's very interesting if you try and do so without actually having read it. You might think this is not a terribly intelligent thing to be doing.
I don't think dogs eat books anyway. but is there some kind of row going on between two disciplines, between the philosophers and the neuroscientists? Is that the way you would describe it?
No, I don't think it's that simple. Quite a large number of philosophers, especially in the United States, have, what you might say, nailed their colours to the mast of neuroscience. I'm thinking of people like Patrick Churchland, Patricia Churchland, and so forth, Daniel Dennett. Others, such as myself, have felt uneasy and have asked a great many questions about the conceptual forms, the conceptual structures that inform cognitive neuroscience at the moment. The fundamental disagreement is not between two professions or two groups of people, but with two forms of thought. After all, the neuroscientists are primarily concerned with pursuing empirical questions, which are ultimately testable by experiment and can be falsified or verified. The pursuit of those experiments presupposes a conceptual framework, a conception of what is meant by such expressions as the mind, the will, perception, memory, imagination, and so forth. That's the conceptual framework which is presupposed, and if there is unclarity about it, the unclarity will spill over into the design of the experiments and into the interpretation of the experiments.
So you're actually saying that because they have their concepts wrong, that they will get wrong results from all those fancy experiments?
Well, two or three different things may happen. One would be that the experiments are badly designed because the concepts are confused. Let me give an example. A great deal of work was done and is being done on voluntary movement and voluntary action. And the framework within which those ranges of experiments are done is the following, that to move your hands or any other part of your body voluntarily is to perform, to make a decision or to perform an act of willing, which then causes the movement. And all the experiments are based on that presupposition. Now, that presupposition is a bit of 17th century metaphysics, not 21st century science, and has been embedded in both philosophical and scientific thought ever since the 17th century. Now, if you pause to reflect, you will notice that every word I'm uttering at the moment is uttered voluntarily, intentionally. None of the words I'm saying are accidental, and so far there aren't any slips of the tongue. But I didn't perform an act of willing before every word I uttered or before every sentence I uttered. Every utterance of mine is voluntarily, but it's not preceded by an act of will.
So the neuroscientists, they have scanners and MRI and big machines. They can see through your brain, they can make great pictures, they can point to it and say, here it is. Mm-hmm. But what is your weapon?
Well, I and philosophers who pursue the subject in the way I do look very closely at the concepts which the neuroscientists are employing and examine the conceptual relations, the relations of logical compatibility, incompatibility, logical consequence, what implications the application of these concepts have for other concepts and for other sentences and utterances.
Are those not just words?
Well, concepts aren't just words, they're abstractions from words, but even if I talk about words, which I do a great deal, and I'm not talking just about words, I'm also talking about what the words signify and what the concepts expressed by those words are. And the phrase just words is a terribly, terribly misleading one, the suggestion being that just words don't really matter, it's things that matter. And to use a rather obvious example, if you're in court with a charge of murder against you and the judge says guilty, that's just a word, but it has quite substantial consequences. So the phrase just words is very misleading. Obviously, the conceptual framework is constituted by the expressions we use in describing the data we have before us, in phrasing the hypotheses that we are testing, and in describing the results of the experimentation, which confirm or disconfirm the hypotheses. But the main thing is that these are two different styles of thought, and both of which have to be involved in any decent cognitive neuroscientific work.
So the concepts are wrong and they need a philosopher to point them to their being wrong. Let's go into the very famous experiments, one of them being that someone has to do a test of whatever kind. It's been repeated many times. And even before someone decides, well, I push the red button or the green button, the hand already moves. So you haven't decided yet, nothing happened in the brain, so to speak, and the hand already moves. So many neuroscientists say your body already shows the decision before your mind is even involved.
Well, that presupposes a sharp division between mind and body, which is itself questionable. It also presupposes that every voluntary movement of mine is preceded by an act of will or an act of decision. And that's just false, as I tried to explain at the moment. I'm, after all, talking perfectly voluntarily to you at the moment, but my speech is not preceded by hundreds of individual acts of will. So there's a misunderstanding about what exactly voluntary action is. And it's only because of that misunderstanding that they can think that they have adequate data to show that the brain decides and later on lets you know that a decision has been made.
So how would you say that we do have a free will? Where would that free will be? Can you point at the free will in a body or in a person?
Well, the free will is a capacity that human beings have. And it's a capacity with two aspects to it. On the one hand, when we act freely, we could have done otherwise. So I may move my hand, but I could have refrained from moving it. And that's something which in normal human action is pervasive. On the other hand, when I decide to do something, form the intention to do something, then I can do what I intend to do, and then I'm acting freely. Both of those aspects have to be present for an action to be an action for which you are answerable, an action for which you're voluntary, for which you're responsible. I don't think there's any question but that human beings have free will in their normal daily lives under normal circumstances. There are circumstances, of course, where criminals may plead diminished responsibility. There are circumstances under which, as a result of brain damage of one sort or another, we are not capable of controlling our own behavior.
Of course, but when we look at the brain, it's the form of the brain. We have little bits of electricity that go around, and then even before you know it, you already start moving. So you could say that the free will might be somewhere in the brain, or that maybe the free will is not something conscious. What would you say about that?
Well, again, try and avoid thinking of free will as a kind of thing and think of it as a kind of capacity. Now, capacities aren't in the brain or in anything. The horsepower of your car isn't in the cylinders and it's not underneath the bonnet. If you pick up the bonnet of the car, you won't find the horsepower. Nevertheless, the car has so and so many horsepower. Human beings have a large range of very distinctive capacities which other animals lack. Capacities for rationality, capacities for thought and inference, and so on and so forth. Consciousness, for self-consciousness, and so on. Those capacities don't have a location, But they do, as it were, have a functional root.
It's
We
like
wouldn't have any of those capacities but for the brain, just as the car wouldn't have the horsepower it has but for the cylinders and pistons.
It's like a soccer team has a team spirit. You don't see it walking, but you're sure it's there.
Yes, that's right.
So that's a conceptual misunderstanding. How can a blooming science with very bright people, with very great results, be so at fault and at mess? How's that possible?
That's a very good question. I think there is a clear answer. In some cases, it does turn out, I believe, that the questions asked were just very bad questions and the results of no value. And I think a large amount of the work on voluntary action falls into that category. But let me give a quite different kind of example. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize for his work on memory. Most excellent work, and surely the prize was deserved. But rather interesting, the work is not really on memory at all. Let me explain. All the work was done on a very primitive organism called a sea slug. They worked on this organism because the cells are very, very large and it's much easier to handle the animal and cut through the nerves and so forth. Now, what is noticed is the reaction of the sea slug upon successive stimulations will speed up. And what Kandel and his team looked at in very, very close detail was the changes in the synaptic connections as a result of successive stimulation. And the assumption was that this change in the behavior pattern was a case of memory, because they defined memory as any change in the behavior of an organism as a result of experience. But if that were what memory is, then if I break my leg and limp, then my limping is a case of remembering something. And that is quite absurd. The reason for that is very simple. Memory is knowledge retained, knowledge that you acquired in the past and you retain it now. Now, the sea slug is such a primitive organism. To ascribe to the sea slug any significant degree of knowledge and retention of knowledge would be absurd. What the work was really on was a conditioned reflex of a certain kind, a reflex action that speeded up or slowed down as a result of
this
stimulus.
is another example of wrong concepts.
Yes.
And what you're actually saying is quite shocking, because that means that a lot of money for science has been wasted on experiments that didn't get the concepts right, so they're not valuable anyway.
Well, they're different cases. The cases of the work on voluntary action I don't think is of any value. The work on the reactions of the sea slug has been very valuable indeed. It just doesn't, obviously, there's no reason to suppose that it has any relevance to memory at all. In other kinds of cases, the research may be first-rate, but the interpretation of the research may be all wrong. So a great deal of the research on vision, for example, which is a huge topic, which has been really very brilliant indeed. They've discovered a vast range of things which were quite unimaginable 30, 40, 50 years ago. Nevertheless, the interpretation they give to their results, I believe, is profoundly mistaken. And you can give very systematic conceptual reasons for the mistakes. That doesn't mean the discoveries aren't genuine discoveries, but the interpretation that is read into the discoveries is wrong.
And so is the case with free will. Another very famous case is the research on the brain. There was Mr. Cage in the 19th century. He was a very nice person. He worked for a railroad company, I think. He had an accident. Something got into his brain. And from one day onto the other, he became the worst person known in the village. He became a villain. He became an uncontrollable, unstoppable jerk. Now, this does seem to signify, this is a very practical example, that the form of our brain does make us into who we are. So there might be some destination already set out for us by the form of our brain.
Well, we can't do anything without a brain. Without a brain, we're dead. And with a malfunctioning brain, we can't behave normally. And no doubt we inherit a wide range of genetic characteristics which features are responsible for certain aspects of our brain and the way it functions. And nobody would wish to deny this. These are straightforward scientific facts that are perfectly well established. Let me give you an example. You can't walk unless the motor centers of your brain are functioning properly. Nevertheless, you don't walk with your brain, you walk with your legs. you can't see things if the visual striate cortex has been seriously damaged in some way, or the optic nerve has been damaged. Nevertheless, it's you who sees, not the brain. The brain doesn't see anything.
This is the essence of the conceptual misunderstanding. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not the only one, but it is a central feature. It's been very common in neuroscience in the last 30 or 40 years to ascribe properties which are correctly ascribable only to the animal as a whole, and the human being as a whole,
to
the brain.
Even they give certain qualities to parts of the brain. They call it mind mapping. They say it's not just the whole brain, it's that part of the brain is love, that part of the brain is hunger.
I mean, what they're pointing out, with some warrant, certainly, is that different parts of the brain are causally implicated in certain human capacities and tendencies and dispositions. And again, there's no reason to dispute this, certainly no conceptual reason to dispute this. It doesn't follow from that it's the brain that falls in love rather than the human being, or that it's the brain that listens to Beethoven's Fifth and not the human being. On the contrary, we couldn't do what we do unless our brain was functioning normally, and unless we had the kinds of brains that human beings do. It doesn't follow that we do all those things with our brain.
But that's the essence, is with our brain, and it's not our brain. So we don't follow our brain. Would there be any circumstance, any discovery that would make you change your mind? For instance, if someone would build a machine that would behave perfectly like a brain, that would be, if you had it on the other end of a phone, you wouldn't even know it was a machine you were talking to. Would that change your mind?
No, for the following reason. Conceptual questions are not amenable to experimental confirmation or disconfirmation any more than mathematical theorems are subject to confirmation or disconfirmation by physical experiments. I mean, if you want to prove a mathematical theorem, it's no use going to a physicist and saying, conduct an experiment to show whether this equation is a correct equation of mathematics. No mathematician would do it, and no physicist would do it. Mathematics is an a priori discipline. Now, conceptual investigation is equally an a priori discipline because you're setting out the rules for the empirical discussion. You're setting out the conceptual framework of what does and doesn't make sense. Now, what does and doesn't make sense is something presupposed in any empirical investigation. And empirical investigations can't affect the existing conceptual structure, although they may induce us to produce different conceptual structures in certain circumstances. That's true.
So if we do have a free will, do we also have a soul?
It depends what interpretation you give to the expression the soul. If by the soul you mean a kind of thing which is in some way embedded in our body, which leaves the body on death and survives after death, then I'm sure the answer is no, that doesn't make any sense at all. If you mean, is there a legitimate use for the word soul in our language, then the answer is, of course, yes. A man might be characterized as saying there is darkness in his soul. That's a very powerful figure of speech, which carries with it a lot of emotional baggage. You may talk about somebody as being a soul in torment. Or again, you may draw a divide between the soul and the body, which is different from the divide between the mind and the body, because we allocate to the soul the moral dispositions, but not the appetites, which are the flesh.
What would the soul then be?
A set of capacities, just like the mind, but a different set of capacities from the mind, because the divide between the mind and the body is not the same as the divide between the soul and the flesh. But we are still talking about distinctive human capacities, the soul being much more closely associated with moral capacities than the mind.
Do animals have a soul?
No.
Why not?
Primarily because they're not language-using creatures, and so they're not capable of self-consciousness. They're not capable of knowledge of good and evil, and they're not capable of reflecting on the rightness and wrongness of their deeds. That's why.
And what is consciousness? Because you use the word, but what is it?
Well, it isn't one thing. The term conscious and consciousness have many uses, which distinguish, first of all, being conscious from being unconscious, awake or asleep. There's nothing terribly problematic about that, although there are lots of borderline cases of being half asleep or suffering from being under hypnosis and so on. That's one divide. Then we have the notion of perceptual consciousness, and that is largely concerned with having your attention caught and held by something. You suddenly become conscious of something like the traffic in the road outside, or you may suddenly become conscious of somebody standing in a corner. That means your attention has been caught and held by what you perceive. Then you may be conscious of a piece of information that you're already in possession, of which you're already in possession, and bear it in mind in what you're doing. You go to visit a friend who's just lost his wife. You're very conscious of the fact that he's grieving and mourning. This changes the way you talk to him, the way you behave to him, the kinds of facial expressions you have. You might say, therefore, all the while I was talking to him, I was very conscious of the fact that he'd recently lost his wife. This means a piece of information that I possess is at the forefront of my mind and modulating, affecting my behavior. Then we talk about self-consciousness. That is yet another range of phenomena. But all these phenomena are, how should I say, they're a pattern of different centres of variation for the expression consciousness. They're connected in rather complicated ways, and you have to look at them carefully. Consciousness is not a single thing. It's a multiplicity of things. Some of them are exclusively ascribable to language users, like self-consciousness. Others are obviously ascribable to other animals too.
Now I would like to ask you, what are the consequences, not just in science, but for society, if we would really not believe in a free will, as some will let us to believe? Mm-hmm. What would be the consequence for a society? Can it be harmful?
Well, I don't think that we could, normal human beings as we are, I don't think we could behave as if we didn't have any free will.
Because we still got to choose if we want a pizza or French fries.
Yeah, exactly. And we still have to decide whether to sit down and get up or
But a thief could say, well, I'm sorry, Judge, it was my hand.
Yes. Yes. So if we start thinking about ourselves in the way in which some neuroscientists recommend we do, namely as machines, it will provide us with a range of excuses which are not really legitimate excuses. It will diminish our sense of responsibility and answerability for our deeds. And those will be very deleterious social consequences and moral consequences. It will alleviate our own sense of responsibility, which should be strengthened, not alleviated. And for no good reason at all. There are cases of diminished responsibility of people who've suffered mental diseases, schizophrenia or paranoia. There are cases where people suffer from diminished responsibility as a result of damage to the brain. This is all perfectly true. We know of those cases, and we try our best to cope with them in as humane a way possible. But the idea that all of us, as it were, lack responsibility, are not answerable for what we do, is both absurd and very damaging to the social fabric of society.
Well, that does leave us with a huge responsibility and a huge burden, because now we're free again and we have to do it all by ourselves.
Well, I don't think anything has changed since human beings became self-conscious creatures, evolved moralities, developed a moral conscience. We have thought of ourselves and acted as free agents. And as free agents, we're also entitled to the respect which is due to every single human being, precisely because they are free, answerable, responsible human beings. If you think that we're just machines, we don't deserve any respect at all.
We should be happy with our free will. You don't read Dutch. Do you have a dog?
No, I don't.
Well, then I will not give you Victor Lamme's book. Thank you very much for this conversation. Peter Hacker, thank you very much.
Thank you.
En dank ook aan u, de kijker. En straks op Holland Doc 24 kunt u kijken naar een aflevering van Profiel over hersenwetenschapper Dick Swaap. En die heet Die fantastische machine in ons hoofd. Dat zometeen. Fijn dat u heeft gekeken. Ik wens u nog een hele fijne tijd.